Good evening and welcome to our discussion of our behavior change replication project. I'm Brandon Gillespie. I live in Michigan. I'm a 25-year-old second semester graduate student at Ball State who works as an RBT at a private ABA clinic in Southeast Michigan.
I'm Megan Costello. I live in Orlando, Florida. This is my third semester at Ball State. I'm currently a teacher in a public school system, and I teach pre-K VE, varying exceptionalities.
Hi, my name is Kasha Moore, and I'm from Indiana. This is my second semester here at Ball State. I'm currently working as a licensed practical nurse at a home health care company for pediatrics with special needs.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Shaw. I'm a 25-year-old graduate student from Pennsylvania, and I'm completing my third semester at Ball State. I also work as an RBT and provide early intervention to children with autism.
Now that we've formally introduced ourselves to you all, welcome again to our discussion about our study that reduces caffeine consumption. We'll spend the next half hour discussing the specific study that we chose to replicate, what the results look like after our replication, and the conclusions and limitations of our work. Getting us started with a review of the study we chose is Megan.
Thanks, Brandon. I will be covering the lit review, the participants, and the setting and the materials that were used in the replication study. Caffeine is considered to be one of the most widely used drugs in the world. Caffeine is defined as a drug because it stimulates the central nervous system and causes increased alertness. Caffeine gives most people a temporary energy boost and elevates mood. Frere et al. Reported that in the United States, more than 85% of adults and adolescents consume caffeine foods and beverages daily. It was found that most American adults consume, on average, 280 milligrams of caffeine each day. According to Knight et al., caffeine intake varies across different types and different populations. Coffee is typically consumed by adults and contains the most caffeine of other beverages. Carbonated soft drinks, teas, energy drinks also contribute to caffeine intake and are favored by adolescents. Children aged 6 to 14 commonly consume caffeine through carbonated soft drinks, while energy drinks and energy shots are preferred by teens and college students. Recent studies have shown caffeine to be a mild reinforcer and that some individuals have trouble lowering their consumption despite having medical issues that are heightened by caffeine. Some of those health issues included high blood pressure, rapid heart rate, and digestive issues. The source study stated that there is a debate whether or not caffeine truly causes a risk factor to health. There are mixed opinions stating that caffeine consumption holds both harmful and beneficial effects. Moderate caffeine consumption has been shown to cause short-term benefits, such as attention and enhanced performance. Caffeine used in lower doses are effective in combating sleepiness. However, caffeine used in high doses have been shown to cause headaches, anxiety, stress, and sleep deprivation. Many individuals have taken the steps to reduce their caffeine intake, but doing so can produce withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms can interfere with day-to-day functions and can include severe headaches, difficulty concentrating, irritability, depressed mood, or even flu-like symptoms. These symptoms can last anywhere between 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on the amount of caffeine that was previously consumed. It was suggested by Mary Sweeney, an instructor who researches caffeine's effects on individuals in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins. The best way to reduce consumption of caffeine is to gradually reduce intake over a period of days or weeks. In this source study, baseline data was collected for 1 week, and then collected data was used to design an intervention. Interventions using gradual reduction of caffeine consumption levels daily were chosen to lessen the withdrawal symptoms. The intervention was implemented in 3 stages. With each behavior modification change, the amount of caffeine was able to be consumed was reduced by approximately 50%. Caffeine consumption was reduced to planned levels, and the reduction was shown as significant. During the intervention, tiredness and headaches were frequently reported. Findings suggest that the interventions were successful. I'll now share with you the participants and the setting of the study, as well as the materials used. Our replication study included 4 participants, 3 females and 1 male, whom all consumed moderate to high consumptions of caffeine. Participants were Megan Costello, Brandon Gillespie, Kasia Moore, and Stephanie Shaw. All of the participants are graduate students earning an online degree in applied behavior analysis from Ball State University. All participants were not familiar with each other prior to the course or prior to the completion of this study. All participants lived in different states in the Eastern time zone. Data was collected at various times by each participant over the course of several weeks, at home, work, or anywhere participants were able to consume caffeine. All participants shared that they were interested in reducing their daily caffeine consumption. The materials that we used for the study included a behavioral interview that included 12 questions to determine how each participant felt about his or her caffeine consumption and the situations in which it occurred, any perceived function, and the benefits of reduction in caffeine. Other materials included a computer, phone, or printed behavior recording form to record data. The behavior recording form was used to record the amount of caffeine consumed daily, as well as withdrawal effects of tiredness and headaches. All participants consumed a variety of caffeinated beverages daily, which consisted of coffee, tea, carbonated soft drinks, and energy drinks. Each participant had access to a shared folder in Google Drive for sharing IOA and fidelity checks with other group members. The participants had a forum on Google Hangout where all communications occurred.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Megan. So I'll be covering the behavior definition, the data collection, the study's design, and also baseline and treatment phases. First, let me begin with the behavior definition that was used for our replication study. The behavior definition for caffeine consumption was defined as any instance of ingesting any beverage, food, or supplement that contained at least 1 milligram of caffeine. Some examples of this behavior will be drinking a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or energy drink. Some non-examples would include drinking a cup of water, a cup of orange juice, or taking a multivitamin. Moving on to the data collection, we collected data using event recording to track the amount of caffeine consumed in milligrams. Each participant used a caffeine consumption behavior diary to track his or her consumption. Participants recorded each time they consumed at least 1 milligram of caffeine through all phases. We tracked the time, date, and amount of caffeine that was consumed. Our caffeine intake was tracked and recorded 7 days a week for a total of 6 weeks. 7 days a week for 6 weeks. Along with recording caffeine consumption, each participant also tracked any daily headaches and tiredness using frequency data. For the design of the study, a changing criterion design was used in the replication. This design allowed us to measure caffeine consumption before the intervention and also during the intervention. During baseline, it occurred over the course of 1 week, where each participant recorded their caffeine intake using the caffeine consumption behavior diary. The diary was set up to record ABC data on caffeine consumption. Participant recorded the date, time, type of beverage, and how much caffeine was consumed. Moving on to the intervention phases, once the baseline data was gathered, the intervention began with a 12-question behavioral interview of each participant, with questions structured pretty much the same as the FBA. The purpose of the interview was to figure out the function of the caffeine consumption and recommend a possible alternative behavior. The intervention phase lasted 5 weeks with 3 stages. Stage 1 was week 2, stage 2 was week 3, and stage 3 was weeks 4 through 6. It required that each participant lower their caffeine consumption using a graduated intervention. The values were determined based on caffeine consumption during baseline and was different for each person. Each participant had their caffeine consumption cut in half in stage 1, and then again in stage 2, and then again in stage 3. All participants recorded their caffeine intake using the behavior diary and also recorded daily headaches and tiredness.
Thanks, Kasha. I will now discuss the IOE data and treatment integrity portions of our study. In the original study that was replicated, IOE data was not taken. In order to incorporate IOE data into the replication, our group came together and brainstormed different ways that this could be done. Considering all participants live in different states, real-time IOE data would prove to be difficult to obtain. Instead, our IOE data was collected by conducting behavioral interviews through the use of live video recording via Google Hangouts. A letter scale was created in order to identify the function of caffeine consumption based on the answers provided by each participant. The letter scale is as follows. A was for attention, E was for escape, ACC was for access to tangibles or activities, and auto was for automatic. Our questions were, how old were you when you started consuming beverages with caffeine? What type of caffeinated beverages do you usually consume or prefer? How many caffeinated beverages do you consume daily? Is there a certain day or days of the week that you find you consume more caffeine? What period of day do you find you have the most consumption of caffeine? Morning, afternoon, evening, night? In what situations are you consuming caffeinated beverages? What is your purpose for consuming caffeinated beverages? And could you go 48 to 72 hours without consuming caffeinated beverages? And during the last 2 months, have you experienced a major change in your caffeine intake? A, no, it stayed the same. B, yes, I stopped drinking caffeine altogether. C, I started drinking caffeine for the first time. D, yes, I started drinking more than I usually do. And E, yes, I started drinking less than I usually do. Once all interview questions were completed, participants compared their scores according to the letter scale and utilized the formula number of agreements over 12 times 100. After collecting our IOA data, findings concluded 100% agreement on the function of caffeine intake, that it was due to automatic reinforcement. Moving on to treatment integrity. When conducting this study, replication, each participant was required to decrease caffeine consumption in half for week 1, week 2, and week 3. By week 3, participants should remain at the caffeine level for the remainder of the intervention. Each participant took daily data on their caffeine intake by recording the type of caffeine source and how many milligrams of caffeine it contained. Participants also recorded factors such as tiredness, productivity, and instances of headaches. Some factors that could interfere with the integrity of treatment are how data is collected and caffeine standards. Since each participant implemented the intervention in different states, it is assumed that everyone took accurate data on their intake of caffeine. However, there is no way to prove this 100% accuracy. The original study also was done using Australian standards. Although we came up with our own standards to fit American measurements, some caffeine products may have different levels of caffeine despite the amount of milligrams ingested. In order to conduct a more accurate study in the future, it may be helpful to have all participants located in the same area and agree to assign the same types or brands of caffeine before starting the intervention.
Thank you all for your fantastic summaries of the research and of our replication. So, to get started, here are the results that we saw across our 4 participants. Participant 1 was Megan, and we saw a very inconsistent baseline of caffeine consumption shown on the graph on the left. She averaged out to about 115 milligrams of caffeine per day. However, as you may notice, the graph on the left has a large spike in days 3, 4, and 5. We can attribute the low levels of caffeine consumption in days 1 and 2 to Megan being sick while on a vacation. What was observed after the baseline was a very consistent decrease in caffeine consumption overall, with a few days spread throughout the study where she drifted above the criteria line before dropping back down. In terms of headaches, shown in the graph on the right, her baseline was 3 days, and these headaches per days per week decreased down to a fairly consistent 2. A different trend was observed with tiredness, again shown on the graph on the right, as the baseline began at 4 and steadily decreased until week 4, where it began trending upward, and in week 6 the number of headache days was 5, which was above the baseline. Tiredness days, rather, I'm sorry. The tiredness results are consistent with caffeine withdrawal symptoms. Moving on to her performance rating graph, the baseline presented a range of 6 to 8. And while there was some variance, the range expanded between 5 and 9 during the intervention phase. The productivity reported by Megan indicates that for her, there may have been a link between caffeine and productivity, as there are more dips in her own perception of performance after reduction. Moving on to participant 2, which is myself, Brandon. My baseline data for caffeine consumption was the most similar to the original study in terms of the amount of caffeine consumed. And much like the original study, my own caffeine consumption was successfully reduced significantly using only the replacement strategy and a restriction on the amount to be consumed. There was only 1 day after the baseline phase in which I consumed more caffeine than I was allowed by the criteria, and that was the first day of the intervention. Going from an average consumption floating around 200 milligrams per day down to around 30 milligrams per day is a very significant change. The headache days data, particularly interesting, as it shows a consistency with the symptoms of caffeine withdrawal. I started with only 1 headache day during the baseline week, saw very similar numbers in week 2, and then had a major spike up to 5 headache days in week 3. There was also an interesting trend in tiredness data, which decreased steadily from 6 days during baseline to 2 days in week 3 and 4, getting as low as 1 day. It did rebound back to 4 days in the final week of the study, however. This trend is interesting because it could show a potential confound to the effectiveness of our intervention and the results of our study. If there were less days where I felt tired, it is possible that the reinforcement value of caffeine was lessened and there was less reason to consume caffeine altogether. Finally, the performance rating data showed a lot of variability across the study. The interesting trend with my own data is that both the highest, 10, and lowest, 2, ratings came after caffeine reduction. There did not appear to be a trend related to caffeine consumption with my own data. Participant 3 was Kasha. She started with an average of about 160 milligrams per day throughout the baseline phase. After the selection of her criteria for week 1, she successfully reduced her caffeine consumption at each stage of the study with no issues. There were no days above the selected criteria line, and she saw the most days of 0 rates of caffeine consumption across all participants. Headache data began with a baseline of 1 and had a steady increase the next 3 weeks before lowering again at the end of the study. Tiredness followed the same general pattern, starting at 2 and trending upward the next 3 weeks before lowering at the end. Both tiredness and headache data show signs of caffeine withdrawal. As you can see, both start to lower, spike up in the middle weeks, and then return back to lower levels in the final 2 weeks of the study. The most interesting data to dissect from Kasha's graphs come from her performance rating. Looking at the baseline average of just over 5 per day, clearly increased as the study went on. Looking at the graph, as you can see, it is a steady upward trend as the amount of caffeine was reduced. This may lend itself to show that Kasha feels more productive when she's not consuming as much caffeine. Participant 4 was Stephanie. She began with a baseline average of 190 milligrams per day. She was another participant that was close to the original study. Of all participants, Stephanie's caffeine consumption was the most variable and inconsistent after we began recording data. In phase 1, she had 2 days where she was above the caffeine criteria that was set. This trend continued into phase 2 as well. In phase 3, Stephanie was under the criteria numbered 9 days out of a total 21 possible, including a spike to 350 milligrams, a level that matched the highest caffeine consumption during her baseline. Despite this, Stephanie still successfully reduced her caffeine consumption from the beginning of the study. The inconsistency and the one spike day both help to explain the lack of caffeine withdrawal appearance in both the tiredness and headache data. Headaches were the most consistent across all participants, with a range between 1 and 2 days for all 6 weeks data was recorded. Tiredness days were the highest for Stephanie during the baseline and for weeks 6, with consistent weeks of 2 headache days per week in the middle 3 weeks of the study. Finally, her performance rating data shows a similar inconsistency to caffeine consumption, as the range for baseline was between 4 and 6, whereas the range for the intervention phase was between 3 and 8. On the next slide, we have a visual breakdown of the averages and ranges across all 4 measures used during the study. Just as a quick breakdown, Megan's range of caffeine consumption for the study was between 0 and 245 milligrams. Brandon's was between 0 and 320 milligrams. Kasha's was between 0 and 259 milligrams. And Stephanie's was between 18 and 350 milligrams. Below that, we have the average caffeine consumption. As you can see for all participants, these numbers, 73.43 for Megan, 66.31 for myself, 44.1 for Kasha, and 82.83 for Stephanie are all lower than the baseline data that we reported at the beginning of the study. This lends itself to showing that our intervention was effective. You can also see the range of tiredness that was discussed, range of performance, and average performance. It's interesting to note that Megan had the highest rating of performance at 7.2, which was almost a full 2 points larger than myself and Stephanie. To finish up, we would like to touch on some of the limitations of our replication. The biggest confound that we encountered was that one of our group members dropped the class in the middle of the semester, with no communication to the group about her plans to do so. In doing this, we lost a SAT of data, a participant, and an additional person to aid in the collection of IOA. The second limitation was our limited access to technology. In the original study, they use a blood work measure to further test the effects of limiting caffeine in one's life. They examine things such as level of cholesterol in the person's blood. Obviously, as for college students, we are unable to access this technology easily and freely. Unfortunately, this limits our ability to fully recreate the results of the study. In addition, we were also limited by the distance between us. Because all of us are spread out across the states, as we mentioned, we did not have the ability to conduct more in-depth IOA procedures. We could not conduct our behavioral interviews in person, as in the study, and so on. In addition, we were also on a deadline for the class, and because of this, the results are not as complete as those from the original study. The original study had a couple more weeks worth of intervention data. This could have allowed for more stabilization of the results, more opportunities for normal weeks for Stephanie, or to not be sick in the case of Megan. On both of those notes, it is also worth noting another limitation that arises simply from individual physiological challenges, things such as illness or extreme sleep deprivation that are not normal conditions for anyone involved. While these conditions cannot be controlled for, the results may have looked different if these situations did not occur during the course of the study. Finally, external factors, things such as job stress and schoolwork, are another factor that was not controlled for and could have easily impacted our results. And as a personal account, my own data was partially impacted by these things. I had 6 very stress-free weeks of school and work. When this is the case, there may have been less of a reason to consume caffeine, since I would have less reason to stay up late and conduct work, or wake up early and solve problems for my job, and therefore would not need the automatic reinforcement of consuming caffeine. Bringing everything together, caffeine consumption was reduced across all of the participants in our replication to varying levels of success. This was consistent with the original study's results that saw the combination of an alternative behavior intervention and the changing criterion design reduce caffeine consumption. In addition, we did observe caffeine withdrawal symptoms in 3 out of the 4 participants, with the one participant that did not see these symptoms having a plausible explanation due to the caffeine spike in the middle of phase 3. Caffeine withdrawal was one of the biggest reasons for the changing criterion design being chosen for this particular study. The dangers of rapid reduction in caffeine are well researched, and we discussed them a little bit at the beginning of this presentation. The fact that we did see them, albeit reduced, confirmed the necessity of this decision. In terms of our replication efforts, we did a great job overall of making the study as close to the original as possible. The main diversion from the original, as I mentioned, stemmed from our inability to access blood testing and the distance between all of us. Other than that, however, we accurately reproduced the methods and overall goals of the study, and our results were consistent. Thank you very much for joining us tonight to discuss our project. Have a great night.